Hey guys, I'm Conlon. I'm a visual effects student in Los Angeles, and today I'm going to show you a suite of tools that I built for color correction in Substance Painter. If you use Substance Painter, you've probably tried to color correct something in it before. And if I had to guess, I would say it probably didn't go exactly as you wanted. In case you don't know what I mean by that, let's go ahead and demonstrate. You'll see here in the middle I have this beautiful sword model and texturing job done by my peer, Rain Ruhani. I'm going to go ahead and add a paint layer to it, and then on the base color channel, I'm going to set it to pass through. This means if I add a filter, it's going to affect everything below it. So my sword will be affected by this filter. Our first filter that we're going to look at is this HSL perceptive because, hue, saturation, lightness, those might be some, classic color correction controls that we're looking for. So first thing, we have this hue. Let's go and see. And I would say, yep, that is actually working as I would expect. It is rotating the hue. Saturation wise, let's go ahead and bump that up. Okay. You might say, at least in my opinion, I'm going to say that this is definitely increasing saturation, but it's also making it look kind of crunchy. To me, at least, this saturation is maybe a bit too strong. You might argue that we do have it pretty high, so we could be a little bit more subtle with it, but in general, I don't love the saturation tool here. And now let's go ahead and say lightness. So I'm going to go ahead and make this sword brighter, make the colors brighter. Okay, so it is getting brighter, we're getting closer to white, and white is definitely going to be brighter than what this sword was before. But if you ask me, it's going to be desaturating the colors too much when we use this lightness slider. And let's go ahead and bump it down. Getting darker, I'm not hating, but getting brighter, I'm going to say that for me, this is desaturating the color too much. It's not really working as I'm expecting it to when I wanted to make my sword brighter. So let's go ahead and look at another color correction tool, which is fittingly called color correction. So this is another built-in tool in Substance Painter, and it's the filter color correction. We have shadows, midtones, highlight control, so different luminance ranges that we're targeting, and you might be familiar with controls like this from something like Adobe Lightroom. Let's go ahead and open up our midtones because I want to affect most of our sword here, so most of the mid-range, not just what's bright and dark. So let's see, contrast. I'm going to increase this contrast slider, and what I'm going to expect to get is to make the contrast between the bright parts of my sword and the dark parts of my sword to increase. So I'm looking for a luminance change that increases the contrast. And as I did that, you can see it gets really crunchy. So let's say, okay, I probably pushed it too far. Let's put it down a little bit. But you can see that this contrast slider, it is making it more contrasty. It's making it more punchy. And it's definitely making that white point and black point separate. But what it's also doing as I turn it on and off, it's making our sword much more saturated. Like I said before, normally I would expect a contrast control, especially one that's specifically nested in a midtone luminance range control. I would expect this contrast control to mostly affect my value or my tone or my luminance or brightness of my texture. So we can see it's affecting our saturation in a weird way. And to demonstrate even more what it's doing is I'm going to go to my Macbeth color chart here, and I'm going to apply that same filter, so that color correct filter, and I'm going to apply it to this color checker here on top. So it's masked on top right now. Let's go ahead and go midtones, contrast, and bump it up. So immediately, once again, we can see the increase in saturation, which is not really something you would expect from a contrast slider. Once again, there is color contrast, but normally this kind of contrast slider, I would be expecting a luminance contrast difference. And another more egregious thing is look at the skin tone here, look at the orange patch here, look at the green patch here. As I'm increasing the contrast, not only is the saturation changing, but the hue is changing. So this skin tone became yellow. From that kind of warm skin tone, became yellow. This orange became red. This green became yellow. And as I go back and forth, you can probably see even more examples. So this contrast slider is not really working as we would hope it would. It's really kind of affecting our colors in a way that, to me at least, is detrimental to the image. Another color correction technique that you might be familiar with in Substance Painter is using blending modes. So let's say you have a texture downloaded from online. In this case, I have this nice marble texture, and I wanted to change the color. Let's say make it more blue. So first I'm going to tile it so I can see it a bit more. Let's say I wanted to make this more blue. So you might be familiar with this technique of adding a fill layer and then color. Let's go ahead and set it to blue and get the blue that we kind of want. And then you might be familiar with some of these blending modes, multiply. Okay, that kind of works. Not exactly the blue that we picked though. Let's try a different one. So I see this one called color. Okay, nice. So that is actually going to be really close to the blue that we picked, if not just exactly that blue. Let's see, tint. Not quite, again, our blue. And let's say, okay, we're pretty happy with color because that's our blue, and let's turn it down a little bit. One issue is if I turn this off and we look at this, we have some really nice color variation in here. So this is kind of more purple, this is kind of more orange, a little bit more green, a little bit more blue. There's a lot of nice color variation in this texture. However, when I use this blending mode technique, I kind of wash it over and overpower all of that color variation that was there before. And you can see we just make it pretty much constantly this blue. If I decrease this, it'll introduce some of that coloration back, but all of a sudden it's not really close to the blue that I was looking for. As artists, we have a creative vision that we're trying to achieve with a certain piece, and we want the control in our tools to achieve that. As you may have been able to gather, Substance Painter does not always give us that when it comes to color correction. So you might be familiar with the roundabout switching back and forth from Substance Painter to Photoshop, Substance Painter to Photoshop, Substance Painter, and just not getting exactly how you want it to look, and then eventually conceding, using some of the built-in tools, getting it a little bit closer to how you want, but at that point you've spent a lot of extra time, wasted a lot of time, and honestly, you've given up a little bit of your creative control just because of the lack of this control. I've been researching color management and color science for the last 10 or so months, and within that research, I was able to develop a color correction filter for Substance Painter and Designer. The intention of this filter is to really increase your creative potential by allowing you the creative control that you need in Substance Painter and Designer directly. I'm going to demo this for you today, and I'd love for you to check it out on my Gumroad page. Once we have the file from Gumroad, we can go ahead and drag it into Substance Painter, and it will detect that it's a filter automatically. If we drag this into our layer stack, it will automatically create a paint layer for us on pass-through. We can also make our own paint layer, set it to pass-through, and add the filter ourselves by finding it in this menu. The first thing I want to do is make it so that it only affects our color channel. This might automatically be updated in a future version of the tool, but for now, you have to manually set it to only work on your color channel, or if you wanted it to work on another type of color channel, you could add that too, such as emission, but for now we're working with just color. We're met with these four options: color space, color space, color space, color space. And that has to do with the first part of this tool, which is that it's color space aware. This is one reason why it's a stronger tool with more predictable results. We don't necessarily need to understand what this means, but if you would like to, I will be having a long, in-depth masterclass on color management and color science releasing on my YouTube channel later. There's currently a trailer out for it on my channel, and I'll be posting that same trailer at the end of this video. Now, all we have to do is follow a few simple steps. We go to Edit, Project Configuration, scroll down, Color Management. We just want to check what this color management is set to and what it says our working color space is. In legacy mode, our working color space is linear sRGB. So I'm going to hit OK. I didn't change anything, I just checked what it said. And I see here, linear sRGB color space, input is linear sRGB. We want to match our working color space to this color space option. So I'm going to click that, and suddenly we have more tabs with our tools. If your project configuration did not say legacy and instead said OpenColorIO Substance, we still want to look at our working color space. In this case, it says linear. This is not super clear wording because it only says linear, but what this is referring to is linear sRGB. So if this is what your color management settings look like, you want to hit linear sRGB. If your color management said OpenColorIO Aces, and then the working color space was Aces CG, you want to hit input as Aces CG. If you're using a custom OpenColorIO configuration, you want to also look at the working space. In this case, it's Aces CG from this OpenColorIO configuration that I've been developing over the last 10 months. This will be available when my color management tutorial video drops. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK and hit it to Aces CG, matching what it said in the settings. This is another custom OCIO config that's releasing with my color management tutorial, and in this case our working space is Scene Linear sRGB, and we can see linear sRGB are the keywords, so we click on linear sRGB. So the first step is just to find what your working color space is and select the corresponding one. It's normally only going to be linear sRGB or Aces CG. This sRGB and preserve input color space are for more niche uses of the tool that you probably won't encounter. In this case, I'm back in my file where it's set to legacy, and in legacy it's linear sRGB, so I'm going to click on linear sRGB. This first step tells the tool what color space we're working in, which allows it to be color space aware and work in a much more natural way. So let's go ahead and start looking at some of the adjustments now that it's been unlocked after picking our color space. The first thing we're going to do is saturation. So I'm going to increase saturation, and let's see how that compares with the saturation on our regular old HSL perceptive node, or filter I should say. So I have saturation on HSL perceptive, and as I increase it to the max, you can see it kind of collapses into this weird shape, and they all collapse kind of into these constant crunchy colors. Let's pump this one to the max, And you can see that it's a much more relaxed shape. It has these crunchy colors in the corners, but it's a much more relaxed shape. So what are these weird colors here? They're known as the Notorious Six. So in digital imaging and with legacy kind of workflows, digital colors can often skew towards these six crunchy, neon, just gross digital colors for red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, and magenta. And it's an issue that a lot of color science is trying to work and correct. If we apply this on our sword, we can simply increase saturation, decrease saturation. Saturation isn't too complex of a operation here, but in this case, we're at least getting a nicer saturation model. I'd like to quickly point out that this saturation model is based off of a work from Quinn Leho and Miguel Santana, who were basing their work off of something proposed by Steve Yedlin, who was the cinematographer on Star Wars The Last Jedi and Knives Out. Next, let's take a look at this color correct filter again that's built in, and let's try and replace some of its functionality. So we want to be able to affect the shadows, midtones, and highlights. We want to be able to change the contrast, and we want to change the luminosity. The corresponding tools for this in my color correction filter are based off of the lift, gamma, gain, and offset controls in DaVinci Resolve and their corresponding color wheels. If you haven't used Resolve or Nuke, you may not be familiar with the terms lift, gamma, and gain. Lift is essentially the same thing as shadows, gamma is essentially the same thing as midtones, and gain is essentially the same thing as highlights. So lift mostly affects our black point, gamma mostly affects everything in between black and white, and gain mostly affects everything that's white. One thing you'll notice is that these tools are a bit more broad in what they affect than a shadows, midtones, and highlight slider is. For example, lift really affects the shadows, and it does affect the highlights, but way less than it does the shadows. Let's see what I mean, and let's decrease the contrast of this image. We can do this by bringing black and white closer. So I'm going to lift up black, and then I'm going to gain down white. As I do that, and I flick that back on and off, you can see we decrease the contrast because we brought black and white closer to each other. Let's increase the contrast by decreasing black and increasing white, and now we have a more contrasty image. Gamma is going to do mostly the midtones, while not really touching our black and white point. Offset is going to be like an exposure, so it's going to affect the entire image uniformly if we exposure up and exposure down. There's also color wheels built into this, so we can add color into mostly our shadows, mostly our highlights, mostly our midtones, or on everything. If I offset color, it will add that same uniform color to everything. If I gain color, let's get that orange in there from the classic orange and teal look. In my highlights, I mostly have orange, and the teal look, I'm going to bring in blue. And so our shadows we're bringing in blue, our highlights we're bringing in orange, and we have something that kind of resembles the orange and teal look. I hope you can see how powerful these controls are, and now I'm going to show you how they work in my filter in Substance Painter. So just as a reminder, by default the filter comes in working on every channel. Let's make sure we only select the channel we want to work on, which is just color. And we can see we have these lift, gamma, gain, offset channel controls, which look pretty familiar, or at least they should, because we have a slider for each one, and then we have a color picker for kind of the color wheel that we had in Resolve. Let's first off lift up our black point. Okay. So we brought our black point up, and now let's see what happens if we gain down our white point. We just brought them closer to each other, and that decreased our contrast. We can increase our contrast by lifting down our black point and gaining up our white point. Let's do it a bit more aggressively. There we go. We now have a much more high contrast sword without getting necessarily as overly saturated and broken as it was before. Let's reset these to their default values. So we want to lift it up to 0. And we want to gain nothing. Now let's go ahead and look at offset. So offset is like that exposure value where it affects everything. So we can expose it up and we can expose it down. And also let's look at gamma. Gamma it up in the midtones, gamma it down. You might notice, I might say, okay, maybe this gamma control, it's a bit too touchy for my liking. Down here we have this control sensitivity reduction. If I increase this, it will make my controls less touchy. So if I increase them, I have more leeway and less of an effect will happen. It essentially makes it so we have more finesse in our control. We can also reduce it. If I make it really low, these controls will have a pretty big effect pretty fast. The default 8 is a nice starting point. And now let's look at the color wheel. We did that orange teal look before, so let's do it again. So the orange teal look is teal is in the shadows, so I'm going to lift my shadows towards teal. And then I'm going to gain my highlights towards orange. And just for good measure, let's gamma down a little bit. And now we kind of have an orange tealish sword, which kind of demonstrates how we can impart color into the black point with lift and the white point with gain. We can also impart color into the midtones, which will more or less affect the black point and white point the least with our gamma. And we can impart color overall with the offset. Earlier, we brought in this marble texture on our sword, and we wanted to make it blue while maintaining that color variation. If we drag this below our color correction filter, and then I reset the settings, we can find that it's much easier to maintain color variation while also imparting a color with these kind of controls. If we use our gain slider, it will keep the black point more or less the same because it will affect it the least, and then it will mostly affect our white point. This allows us to add color into our sword, into the marble, while maintaining that kind of hue relationship that we can see. This is similar to this image of this train, which is a blue image, but because of simultaneous contrast, which is a piece of color theory, this appears red. So it maintains, just like that, it maintains the hue relationships that were originally there, because this looks more yellow than this looks more blue and purple than that, this looks more green than the rest. It maintains those hue relationships while still imparting that constant color on everything. If I turn off my marble, we can still see that in our sword as well. So if I turn this off and on, we can see that this is more red than this. And now if I have it on, it's going to make everything blue, but we can still see those hue relationships, especially if I push it by increasing saturation and lightness. We can see it's really making it blue, but it's not completely overriding that color that was originally there. We still have that nice color separation and color variation. The next part of the tool is my favorite, and it's this Tetrahedral Colorshift tab. This tool is another one that was inspired by Steve Yedlin, who showed this tool in his display prep demo. InPeason on GitHub developed a tool based on this demo, and that was a piece of work that I referenced while creating my filter. We were met with a lot of different menus, but we can see here, if we break it down simply, we can see red, 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 green, 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 blue, 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 cyan, 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 magenta, 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 yellow, yellow, yellow. Those are the primary colors and the secondary colors, where red, green, and blue are the primary colors, and cyan, magenta, and yellow are our secondary colors. We have 3 sliders for each of the primary and secondaries, and they each have red, green, and blue, red, green, and blue, red, green, and blue. So how can we use this tool? Let's get a feel for this tool by just messing around with some of the sliders. The first one is called Red Redshift. I'm going to increase it. Okay, and now I'm going to decrease it. So just by messing with the slider, I can kind of see what's happening. The color red, which is this handle was already red before I did anything, I'm shifting red into it and out of it. So as I increase it, it makes the sword handle more red. As I decrease it, it makes it less red. Let's use the next slider. I'm going to green shift red, so I'm going to add green to the red. Green and red mixed together is yellow, so it becomes yellow, and then as I add more green, it becomes green. Blue, so let's blue shift it. I'm going to add blue to the red. Okay, cool. So we can see with red, we're able to take what was just red before, and we are able to change the red, green, and blue amount of what was specifically red before. Okay, well next I'm going to do cyan. So I'm going to, let's add a red into cyan. We can see that maybe I was expecting just this circular part to get caught, but if I turn this off, this over here is also cyan, it's just maybe not as stark. So it makes sense that the filter is also affecting that stuff that is cyan. Let's go ahead and add more green to the cyan. Okay, let's say I wanted to make it more cyan-y. Cyan is green and blue, so I'm going to increase blue as well. So now I'm adding more green and blue to the cyan, which is making the cyan more cyan-y. Note that, like the red, this is only affecting what was already cyan. Just like this slider was only affecting the handle, which was already red. I hope you can already see how powerful this is, but let's dive into how powerful it really can be. This is a visualizer I made to show how you can affect colors just by changing the red, green, and blue amounts. And as we saw, what we have in here is a filter that allows us to change the red, green, and blue amounts for every color, primary and secondary, split up. And this is done without masking. If I change the red, green, and blue amounts and scramble them around, we can unbalance them and create different hues. The next thing up is saturation. If I make my red, green, and blue amounts closer to being equal, they're going to go ahead and be desaturated. If we go back to the handle, we can see it's mostly red. So if I decrease red to make it mostly like the other ones, it looks more desaturated. I now see it looks a little bit yellowy, and yellow is from red and green. So I'm going to keep decreasing red, but I'm also going to decrease green a little bit. I'm going to decrease green a little bit more. We've desaturated that red because what we've done is took away the dominant color, which is red, and we made them closer to each other. We could saturate by making them less equal to each other and making one color stand out more. Red is already standing out, but I'm going to make it stand out even more by pushing red away from the rest and shifting green and blue away. And that is just max saturation, max popping. So you can see how with RGB, we can change the saturation. We can also change the luminance with RGB control if we increase or decrease them all the same amount. If I cyan, red, green, and blue shift all the same amount to the top, what that does is it makes all the cyan stuff lighter. It doesn't make everything else lighter though. You'll notice without masking, it was only increasing the cyan. If I make them all darker by the same amount, it darkens just the cyan. So you can see if I change red, green, and blue equally, I can make something darker or brighter. The next thing is color temperature. As artists, a lot of the time we'll talk in terms of warm and cool. So I can make something warmer if I decrease the amount of blue in it and increase the amount of red. So let's say we wanted this blue or cyan to be a warmer cyan. So I'm going to reset what we had before, and I'm going to increase red and decrease blue. If I turn that off and on, it's clearly a warmer cyan. We see we can also make a color cooler by decreasing red and adding blue. On this red handle, I'm going to decrease red and add blue. And if I turn that on and off, it's now a cooler color. We can see we can also affect the tint of a color of magenta and green by decreasing or increasing green. So I'm going to tint the cyan up towards green, and I'm going to tint it down towards magenta. You might encounter something interesting when it comes into color mixtures. So as we saw, this red is mostly red, but it's a little bit orangey. So it's a little bit of a mixture of yellow and red. So let's say we wanted to make this yellow smiley face blue. So I'm going to yellow blue shift. We made our yellow smiley face blue, but it also affected the red handle. That's because this red handle was a mixture of red and yellow. It wasn't just a pure red. How can we make just the smiley face towards blue? Well, we can see here that this is just yellow, but this is a mixture of yellow and red. So when we did yellow, it affected both. But if we affect red, it will only affect the handle. So we can do an inverse operation. So we shifted yellow towards blue, which affected both. We can now do the inverse of that and shift red away from blue, and now it will make the handle less blue and kind of counteract what we did with the smiley face. So now we've made the smiley face more blue, but we've kept the handle's redness by counteracting what we did with the color mixture. I hope you can see how powerful this Tetrahedral Colorshift tool is, because it's able to shift our colors around without actually doing any masking. So it's able to target very specific hues, and we're able to kind of do any color operation on it because we have access to R, G, and B. And once again, with R, G, and B on a certain color, we can change the saturation, hue, brightness, color temperature, and color tint. One way that it's especially useful, actually, is when you have something that's hand-painted. So sometimes in Substance Painter, I might just use a lot of fills with masks. And in that case, it would be procedural and I could change the color. Sometimes, though, you might have just painted everything more like a traditional painting method. You know, I might have painted some here, changed the color, painted something here, changed the color, painted something here. Some may argue it's not the best way to work, but it lets you do more of a cohesive color blending while you're painting, and it might feel more natural to people used to hand painting. The control we lose here is the proceduralism, but if we use our Tetrahedral Colorshift, all of a sudden we're able to access these hues independently again. So let's say we want to make our green more saturated, we can green shift towards that. If we wanted to make it darker, we could just decrease the amounts and then of everything, and we can make it more saturated. And that's all happening even though all of our stuff is on one paint layer. So it's a really powerful tool. Another powerful use case of this tool comes when you have textures from other sources. So let's say I have this rusty metal, and let's say I wanted to make my sword a green metal. And now I want to rust just a little bit of it. So I'm going to put a mask and I'm going to paint just a little bit of rust here. The issue is this texture, the paint that was from this texture was blue. So it's not matching with our green paint. Previously, to fix this, what we would have to do is bring this to Photoshop, create a mask of what's blue, color correct it, bring it to Substance. We'd probably be wrong, so we'd go back to Photoshop. It'd probably be back and wrong, but back and forth, back and forth. Let's just add my filter on top of this texture. Once again, make sure it's only on color. And once again, we're on linear sRGB. That's just how my settings are in this specific scene file, but as I showed, you can use a bunch of different settings in here and just click on the right corresponding one. Let's Tetrahedral Colorshift, and we're working with blue paint. So let's make the blue, let's green shift it just to make it more green. And that actually is pretty close already, just from green shifting. If our color temperature was a little bit off, we could go and reference this again and we could change our green blue amounts, or if our tint was different, we could, do that. But already that's really close. And it looks like that is the same paint. You can see how powerful this tool is. It's not using any masking and is able to isolate these color ranges, and we can dial it in directly in Substance Painter. Thank you for checking out my tool and this video. I hope I've shown you the kind of control that you can get from this tool. I'd like to once again thank Rain Rouhani for letting me use this sword asset. This is her LinkedIn, and we have her demo reel and website on raincreates.com. She's a wonderful artist and a great friend and person, so please check her out. My tool for Substance Painter and Substance Designer can be found on my Gumroad, which will be linked in the description, and I really hope that you guys can unlock the full power of this tool once you start combining it with masking and other Substance Painter techniques. This is part of the 10-month deep dive that I've been doing in color management and color science, and I'm going to be releasing a long-form, in-depth color management tutorial in the next, few months. So keep an eye out for that, and there's going to be a lot of gems in that covering a lot of your favorite software. So thank you for checking out my tool, and I hope you have a great day.